We've talked multiple times recently about the tabernacle of God and how the tabernacle was instituted during the time of Moses as a place where God could actually dwell among his people. If you think back to the Garden of Eden, where God actually dwelled with Adam and Eve in the garden, he would walk and talk with them. And then sin brought about a separation where God could not dwell directly with his people because his people were imperfect and he was not. And so God eventually, during the time of the wandering in the wilderness, God instituted, he told Moses to build a tabernacle for him. And there was a certain spot in the tabernacle called the Holy of Holies where God's presence would come and it would dwell. And our Old Testament reading today talked about that. It talked about the time when it first came and was filled and how Moses himself couldn't even go in anywhere in the tabernacle at first because God's presence filled the entire place. Eventually, God's presence settled into the Holy of Holies there, and that was a signal when Israel should stay where they were or when they should get up and move somewhere else. When the presence of God stayed on the tabernacle, they stayed put. Sometimes it was for a day, sometimes it was for years. When his spirit raised up, they would tear everything down, they would carry it to the next spot, and when God's spirit would stop, they'd set it all back up and it would settle in there. And so God's spirit, heaven on earth, dwelled inside the tabernacle. And then eventually Solomon built a temple for God. And when he built the temple, all of a sudden God's presence came and dwelt inside the temple. So now heaven on earth was inside the temple of God inside of Jerusalem. And there were all kinds of restrictions and different things that went into this. You couldn't just go waltzing into the temple or waltzing into the tabernacle without having certain standards of cleanliness that you met. Certain things would disqualify you from being able to go in for a period of time. You had to be ceremonial clean to be inside. There were certain parts of the temple that were only open to the priest. There was the one part where the presence of God dwelled that was only open to the high priest, and that only once a year. We talked about that. So heaven and earth dwelled inside the temple. Eventually Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple. The people of Israel rebuilt it. And then in AD 70, the Romans destroyed the temple. Heaven on earth was taken away and destroyed by the Roman Empire. And the temple has never been rebuilt to this day. If you've ever wondered why the people of Israel don't rebuild the temple, it's because the spot where the temple would be built is where the Muslim Dome of the Rock is right now. So there is no way that they can build their temple in that original site there. So heaven on earth has been taken away. But does God's presence still dwell on earth today? You see, in Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, it says, "When the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place. And suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And divided tongues of fire appeared on them and rested on each one of them. And they were filled with the Holy Spirit," God's Spirit, "and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance." The bodies of the followers of Jesus are the new temple. Heaven on earth dwells inside of you and inside of me. So what are we filling our bodies with? What are we taking in? Do we have the same kind of safeguards over our own body that the temple and the tabernacle had there to limit what comes in and what comes within close contact to God's presence? Think about your daily rhythms, the things you go through every day and how those things influence you. Maybe when you get up in the morning or sometime during the day, you end up picking up your phone. What apps are you looking at? How are they influencing you? What are you taking in? And how is it conforming you? Maybe you head into work and you start to talk to your coworkers. What are the kinds of things you're talking about during just your spare time with your coworkers? How are those conversations conforming you? Maybe you go home afterward and you relax and you turn the TV on. What are you watching? How is the programming that you're taking in conforming you? How is it influencing you? How is it having hold over you? Maybe you just want to relax and sit in front of your computer. What websites are you pulling up? What are you looking at? What kind of influence do those things have in your life? Or maybe you just want to sit back and read a good book, right? What books are you reading? What is it doing? What is it communicating to you? What kind of a worldview are you seeing through the eyes of the author? How is it conforming you? Romans chapter 12, verse 2, this is one of the ones Scott read for our New Testament reading. I'm going to reiterate it now. It says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." How are you being conformed? What things shape you? What things influence you and bring you into the worldly kind of mindsets that can so easily get inside our bodies? Each of us is influenced in more ways than we realize. There's a teacher and author out there, Brad Gray, who's got a ministry called Walking the Text. And I love his ministry, because his ministry is all about understanding first century culture. So he spends time trying to teach you about the culture in which Jesus lived, and then he tries to teach you also about like what it was like when Paul was going around and spreading the gospel and writing the different letters of the New Testament. And he's got a great series, I think it's 6 or 7 parts, on life in the Roman Empire. And so it's up on YouTube. It's also in podcast form. I watched the first couple on YouTube. I've listened to several more of them in podcast form. And it's just very eye-opening as you see the different things that were true of the Roman Empire. You better understand some of the teachings of Paul in his letters in the New Testament. And the first episode was my favorite. It was on the theater in ancient Rome. Theater in ancient Rome. And he says that, so here's some of the highlights from what he had to say about the theater in ancient Rome. In the Roman Empire, people would go to the theater to just unwind and relax and just kind of enjoy themselves. But in the Roman Empire, theater was not solely focused on entertainment. You see, theater in the Roman Empire was primarily focused on education. It was primarily focused on education. It was focused on educating you on a worldview. You see, the Romans believed that when people came in to be entertained, they let their guard down all of a sudden. And so now they were more easily to be influenced. So the Roman Empire, they would use the theater to tell culture where they thought they should be going. If you wanted to change the course of culture back in the Roman Empire, you would start with introducing concepts and ideas in the theater. And he said the goal of the theater was to educate you, was to entertain you into an education. To entertain you into an education of a worldview that they wanted you to adopt. And he also points out that some things haven't changed much in the last 2,000 years. Think about it for a minute. Think about today. Today, if you want to lead culture in a certain direction, start in Hollywood, right? Start with some of the concepts that are kind of taboo or really out there. You start to see them come through in Hollywood in movies and things. At first, some of the things we see on TV or in movies can be shocking. But over time, as we see them portrayed over and over again, those things become normalized. And the one thing he points out is back in the Roman Empire, and I think today too, one of the primary ways this is done is with comedy. Because if I can get you to laugh at something, I can get you to consider it. And if I can get you to consider it, I might be able to get you to eventually accept it. Think, for example, about movies you watch, right? Think about romantic comedies, right? Do I have any people here that like Hallmark Christmas movies? Okay, yes, we have a bunch of Hallmark Christmas movies fans in the house, right? So think about your Hallmark Christmas movies. Oh man, we got some people that are down with the Christmas movies. It's okay, we forgive you. So anyway, but think about, big city girl has to go home because some kind of dad fell and hurt himself, and he can't harvest in the orchard this year or whatever. So big city girl has to go back to the country, right, and help out her family. And what happens? When she's there, she runs into the incredibly attractive 40-year-old man that has no prospects of dating anyone, right? Because his heart was broken and he just has happened to be single all this time. And so they get together and they start hanging out, and they start to kind of develop feelings for each other, right? But then something happens. They're getting closer and closer, and you think, oh, they're really gonna like get this and get together and get married one day. And all of a sudden something happens about 10 minutes before the movie's over. All of a sudden that the guy finds out, your name's not really Mary, your name's Jennifer. Why did you lie to me all this time about your name? Right? I don't know that I could ever trust you if you will lie to me about something, so I want nothing to do with you, right? And so he storms away in anger, and then a few minutes later, after the next commercial break, they come back together, and he realizes, I don't care if you've got 17 different names. I love every one of them, and I love you, and I will spend the rest of my life with you. And then the moment in the Hallmark movie where they both get it, and they're both in love, is when they kiss. And then when they kiss, and the movie ends. So one time we were watching a Hallmark movie, and for some reason the writers decided to go completely off the Hallmark script. And about halfway through the movie, the couple kissed for the first time, which is, that never happens. So they kissed, and I picked up the remote and I turned the TV off. And Amy said, "What are you doing?" I said, "It's over. They kissed," right? Then I turned it back on and we watched the rest of it. But it's the predictable formula, right? And you know they're in love when they kiss. That's the point when you know they're in love. But think about a major Hollywood romantic comedy movie, like we're talking big screen, not you watch it on Hallmark, but you go to the theater and watch it, or eventually it comes out on DVD. The big time ones. How do you know the couple falls in love? Because you still usually have this tension, you still usually have a misunderstanding. But what happens when the couple falls in love? In a major Hollywood movie, when the couple falls in love, they have sex. Right. Because Hollywood has communicated to us over and over again that the way you know that you're in love is when you're ready to have sex with someone else. And your marital status does not matter at all. But that's the Hollywood worldview, and so they've been communicating to us over and over and over again in the movies that we watch in an attempt to desensitize us to any worldview other than that worldview. Think about your 90s and early 2000s sitcoms, right? This was just good quality entertainment, because sitcoms today are just garbage, right? I'm just going to say they're just absolute garbage. But good old wholesome stuff. Right? Family Ties, remember Michael J. Fox, right? Growing Pains, Alan Thicke and Kirk Cameron, right? Or Family Matters. I mean, who didn't like Steve Urkel, right? Like, really, family, like good wholesome programming. But as you go back and you look at these and you watch episode after episode, you see kind of a formula that exists in the sitcoms too. And the formula works something like this. The dad of the household, he is super lovable, but he's kind of the lovable idiot, right? Because he's got all these great ideas and things, and he always makes some big, humongous blunder that is a problem. And who comes behind him and fixes it, right? Mom, the intelligent, stable presence in the household, comes behind dad and fixes the problem. You end up loving them both, but you very much see that the dad just kind of bumbles through life, and his wife continually comes behind him and cleans up all his messes for him. And this is a message that's communicated over and over again in sitcom after sitcom, this idea that masculine qualities aren't as highly valued as feminine qualities. And I think it's done as a overreaction to the way that we have, elevated men over women for so long throughout history. So they feel a need to do the opposite now, to elevate women over men. And you see for generation after generation now, as masculine qualities get downplayed and feminine qualities get lifted up, we see men struggling more and more with masculinity as young boys start to turn into men. Or think about quality family entertainment, right? I mean, if you're trying to think of what do I show my kids for good old-fashioned entertainment, like who doesn't love Disney, right? I mean, we have theme parks, we have movies galore, we have Snow White, Cinderella, Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse. Like, who doesn't love Disney, right? Because I can sit my kid in front of the television and I can know that they're getting good, wholesome family programming. Or are they? You see, there were several leaked videos that came out a few years ago with higher-up people at Disney having conversations where they said that they were very intentionally trying to put LGBT characters into as many children's programs and movies as they could. And the one thing we've begun to see is as this started with, the biggest name one was Lightyear when that came out, Buzz Lightyear's backstory. And we've seen other movies and shows come out since then. And whenever they come out with a very overtly gay character, the movie ends up tanking in the box office. Or the TV show ends up running its course and not getting renewed. Because it's not bringing in near the money that they're expecting. And they're literally losing millions and millions and millions of dollars every time they do this. But the interesting thing is, they're still doing it. And the reason they're doing it is because Disney is more concerned with educating your children on a worldview than they are about making profits right now. Because they know, if I can continue to put this in front of children over and over and over again, then they'll become desensitized to it, and all of a sudden we'll start to shape the worldview of the generation. And then eventually we'll get to the point where their worldview will be the dominant worldview, and then they can continue making profits again, but in a world that looks much more the way that they want it to look. Think about it. Profanity, sex outside of marriage, talking back to your parents. Think about 30, 40, 50 years ago, how those things were viewed versus how we're viewed today. Certain things have just become so normalized now because the entertainment industry has shaped our culture and has educated us on a worldview, because we sit down, we let our guard down, and we start taking things into our body that sometimes we have no business taking in. So what's next? where is the entertainment industry trying to take us from here? Well, there's a lot of different things they're trying to do. But one thing, back in 2010, TLC came out with a show called Sister Wives. I don't know if any of you have seen this or heard of it before. This fall is the 19th season of Sister Wives. Yes, 19 seasons. So I went on the site because I've never watched this before in my life, but I went on the site and I'm like, what is this even, like what all is the premise here? So this is a synopsis they give. Cody, father and husband, fell in love, then fell in love again, and then again. This is a story of Cody Brown, his 3 wives, and their extraordinary family. Now, season 1, they say, is focused on Cody meeting and courting who is to become his 4th wife. And in season 1, episode 6, the other 3 wives actually go out with his fiancée, Robin, and help her pick out a wedding cake and a wedding dress. And so at first, it seems shocking, right? But as people begin to watch this season after season after season, it becomes a little more normalized. And so we're taking something like polygamy, which is like a no-no in culture, and we're trying to make it something that is more accessible, that you're more comfortable around, that you're more comfortable with the concept of. Because after all, if the saying that we hear over and over again is true, that love equals love and you can't tell someone who to love and not love, why can't you fall madly in love with 2 people or 3 or 4? Right? They're trying to educate you on a worldview. We're seeing this over and over again in entertainment. So as we take in entertainment, as we take in things, we have to remember that the entertainment industry is not neutral. They're trying to educate us on a worldview. They're trying to conform us to a view that many times is contrary to what God wants us to be living. But the entertainment industry is not the only way that people get influence in our lives. Think about media for a second. Where do you take in your news? Where do you go to get your news sources, right? Because media on both sides is bias, right? So if you want to find like left-leaning kind of news outlets, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, that's an awful lot of letters, New York Times, Washington Post, Baltimore Sun, and even your beloved Carroll County Times here are all left-leaning publications, news sources, websites. There are also ones that are right-leaning, politically right. Fox, The Daily Wire, Newsmax, Talk Radio, The Washington Times, The New York Post. These are all outlets that tend to be right-leaning. So if you were to pull up The Daily Wire on your phone right now, and I'm not suggesting you do it, but if you were to pull it up right now, you would notice a pattern. Articles about Donald Trump will tend to be favorable about him. Articles about Kamala Harris will be very unfavorable toward her by and large. Then if you were to go pull up MSNBC on your phone next, you'll see the exact opposite. Articles about Harris will elevate her. Articles about Trump will be about the nasty, underhanded things he's done. So what are your sources? Where are you going to take in media? One of the interesting things I found, because we've been focusing on this for a few weeks with the youth group that meets at our house, the Holy Donut Club, and trying to help them kind of open their eyes to these things as well. And so as I talked to them about where do you take in your media, the interesting thing is none of them took it up from television or the newspaper, right? That's not where they get their news. They get their news on social media. They get it over the internet. But it's interesting, right? Because Google, YouTube, who's owned by Google, Facebook, Instagram, Microsoft, Reddit, they are all left-leaning organizations that have a certain worldview and a certain political bias. And the interesting thing is they control so much of what you see when you pick up your phone or you get on the internet. You know, how many of you have Gmail accounts? Like I've got multiple Gmail accounts, right? So they did a study a while back and they found that if you were getting political kind of themed emails sent to you, that if they were right-leaning emails, they were more likely to end up in your spam than left-leaning emails were. So Google is actually having some amount of control over what you find in your inbox if you have a Gmail account. But it's not just that. Google controls where the vast majority of us search, right? Like almost all of us go to a Google search engine to search. And so when you do, Google determines what search results come to the top and what are buried so far down that you'll never find them. So they have say over that. YouTube and Facebook, they have serious control over what you can share with your friends and what you can send around because that's some of the primary ways we spread things around. So think about for a second, I don't know, how many of you remember 2020 election cycle, the big thing that hit in October, the New York posted an article on Hunter Biden's laptop. Anybody remember the Hunter Biden laptop scandal? Okay. So now the thing is, most of us don't read the New York Post, right? It's not like the Times where you can go find in different places even if you're not in New York. So the way that the article from the Post was getting around was they were sharing it on social media. People would take the article, they'd share it on Twitter, they'd share it on Facebook, they shared on YouTube. This was the big October surprise that was going to propel Donald Trump into the White House again, was the Hunter Biden laptop scandal. But the social media companies all decided that they were not going to allow you to share the story. So if someone put the story up, they would take it back down. And over again, they would take it down so you could not see it. And the vast majority of Americans knew nothing about this story until after the election was over. Why? Because those companies have a certain political worldview, and they wanted to make sure that their worldview was not disrupted by someone other than the person they were voting for getting elected. And it's still going on now. This was one of the big reasons that Elon Musk actually bought Twitter, because he was so concerned that there was a monopoly of companies, all of one ideology, that were trying to control what you could and could not communicate out on the internet. So we've even seen things recently. Recently, during the election cycle, Donald Trump did a 3-hour interview with Joe Rogan. And Joe Rogan is probably the most popular podcaster in the country. He has a tremendous audience. And so people wanted to view it. So if you went on YouTube to view it and you searched on YouTube for Donald Trump, Joe Rogan interview, you would get snippets of the interview. But for some reason, the search was not allowing you to see the full 3-hour interview until it was brought to their attention and somebody fixed the unfortunate problem and allowed people to find it. There was also something going on during the election cycle where if you have an Alexa in your house and you say, Alexa, should I vote for Donald Trump? Alexa's response was, I can't provide content that promotes a specific political party or a specific candidate. That sounds fair, right? Like, I don't need my electronic device telling me who I'm supposed to vote for. Like, I ought to be intelligent enough to figure that out myself. But the interesting thing was, if you ask Alexa if you should vote for Kamala Harris, Alexa would give you a list of her accomplishments and why she's a very good candidate. Now, this unfortunate error got fixed as well when it was brought to their attention. But you can see that over and over again, the places where we take in our media, the places where we take in our news, they have a way of controlling what we can and can't see. And they have a way of influencing us because they're trying to educate us on a certain worldview. Now, some of you might be thinking, it's okay, I figured out that media was biased years ago, so I only look at media that is of my political persuasion, right? So if I'm the left, I go to the Daily Wire, I go to Fox News. If I'm on the right, I go that way. If I'm on the left, I get my stuff from MSNBC, I go to CBS, CNN, that's where I get my news from. So I've already got that covered. But the interesting thing is, not every media personality with your political persuasion has a biblical worldview. And so just because you're taking in media from people that kind of agree with you on the political spectrum doesn't always mean that you're taking in things that you should be. So customizing your media intake doesn't necessarily always help. Think about it for a minute. Think about the week after the election here. If you were of the left-leaning persuasion, and after the election, if you went on MSNBC or you went on CNN, you would find some very angry, profanity-laced rants that were going on, right? From people that were not happy with the decision that was made. And you would also run across articles where people were telling you that if your family members voted for Donald Trump, you should not associate with them, you should not have Thanksgiving dinner with them, you should cut off all ties because they voted for hate and you're not a hateful person. Now, if you were on the right and you went and started looking at your sources, you would find something completely different. But you'd be very likely to find articles that are mocking Joe Biden, mocking Kamala Harris, mocking people on the left. You'd find a lot of content that was created, different memes and videos that make them look bad, that you can easily share with your friends so you can get an easy laugh at someone else's expense. But once again, that's not very Christ-like, is it? Right? So just because someone has your political persuasion doesn't mean that every way they're communicating that is the way we need to be taking it in. We need to have enough foresight to see that this is healthy and this is not at all healthy. So the entertainment industry is trying to conform you to a worldview. The media is trying to conform you to a worldview. The education system is trying to conform you to a worldview. You and your children and your grandchildren. Think about science class, right? Think about your high school biology class where you learned about the origins of humans, right? And if you were in public school, you were taught that humans evolved from monkeys through a series of random mutations. Now, there's something interesting in science. In science, we have laws and we have theories. So laws are things that can be repeatedly demonstrated over and over again, so we have absolute certainty these things are true. The law of gravity, right? We accept that is not a theory. There's no theory of gravity. It's the law of gravity because we know it to be true. But the education system has decided to take something like evolution, which is a theory, and treat it as a law. We can't teach any other form of creation than that. That's the only thing we can teach in schools. But I can give you 5 different theories on the origins of humans. One is what I'll call classic evolution, the fact that you started out as a monkey, and then over millions of years, through random mutations, we got to where we are today. There's another view called theistic evolution. It's the idea that we evolved from monkeys, but God was the one doing the changes in the gene pool rather than random mutations happening. There's another theory out there called intelligent design. Now, intelligent design as a theory does not take a stance on whether or not evolution was the means that things were created, but what it does say is there's so much complexity to the universe, to people, to animals, that there's no way that could have happened by random chance. There has to be some intelligent designer and intelligent creator behind what is going on. There's also what's called short day creation, the idea that the Bible's day 1, day 2, day 3 in Genesis are literal 24-hour days, and then if you extrapolate the genealogies out, you get somewhere between 6,000 to 10,000 years for the age of the earth. Short day creation theory. There's another one called long day creation theory that still theorizes that the earth is millions of years old, but what they do is they say that the term day in Genesis, it can also be translated to represent an age. So instead of 24-hour periods, day 1, day 2, they were like an age. The first age, the second age, the third age. And so periods of very long time can go between them. These are all 5 theories. These are what we call part of the historical science theories, right? Because they're not something that you can consistently demonstrate and test in a lab. And so we all have the same kind of pool of evidence, but that evidence can be interpreted different ways, and each of these theories has some level of credibility behind it, but you only get taught one. Why do you get only taught one? Because the public education system is trying to communicate a worldview to you, and they're trying to communicate a worldview that is absent of God. And there is so much more going on, too, that we don't even have time to get into today. Don't even get me started on colleges. Colleges are trying to educate our young people on a worldview that is very different than a Christian worldview. You and I don't live in neutral territory. The entertainment system, industry, the media, education, it's all trying to conform us to a certain worldview. And that's just 3 examples. I could give you umpteen million more of things that come into our life that are trying to educate you on a worldview. Some of the things we're taking in reinforce a biblical Christ-centered worldview. Many of them do not. So how can we make sure that the outside world voices that are coming into us are not shaping our worldview into something that is different than what God wants us to be taking in? How do we keep ourselves from being conformed to the ways of the world so that we can be transformed and renew our mind, as Paul talks about in Romans? So there's actually a lot to this. There's a multifaceted way to deal with this, and we are going to be spending a lot of time in the next coming months looking at this. But today I want to start simple. Today I want to start with addition by subtraction. So I want you to identify what you take in an average day and consider how the things you take in are influencing you. How are the things you're taking in influencing you? And then start seeing what you can cut out of your life to limit the amount of external influence. Years ago, I did this with television, right? Because I used to watch a lot of television, and I got to the point where I realized that a lot of it was not conducive with the biblical worldview, and I was constantly taking in garbage. And so I cut out almost all TV out of my life. Now, as I've been going through this process the last couple months, I realize the thing I need to start regulating is my phone usage, right? It's so easy to pick up the phone, and I've got access to anything I want. Anytime I'm waiting in line, anytime I've got like 2 extra minutes to kill, it's so easy to pick it up and start looking through things and going through stuff. And a lot of times I'm taking in things that I don't need to be taking in, right? So identify what are those things for you where you can start cutting back. Because once we start limiting the things that conform us, then it becomes easier to start putting things into our lives that transform us. So in the coming weeks, we'll be looking more and more at what to put into our lives to transform us. But let's make some space for that first. Let's make some commitments today to start looking at what we can cut out of our lives, how we can take some of the worldly influence out so that we're ready to be transformed into the mind of Christ, so that we can better discern God's will and live a life that is honoring and pleasing to Him. Let's pray. God, I thank you. I thank you that you love us so much, that you want that relationship with us. I thank you that you give us that opportunity to have a relationship with you. God, you gave us an example in Jesus of how to live life, and you want us to live out life that way. You want us to follow his example, put his teachings into practice, live out the commands and the different things we see in the Bible so that we can live life the way you designed us to live it. But there are so many competing interests in the world right now that are trying to tear us away from that. There are so many out there that don't live by a biblical worldview and think that we should not either. God, I pray for number one thing today, I pray that you would open each and every one of our eyes, God. Just make it abundantly clear to us when we are taking in things that are contrary to your worldview. And then, God, help us to set barriers, guide rails in our lives so that we limit the amount of things we're taking in that are trying to pull us away from you. We want to recognize when it's coming up, and then there's certain safeguards we want to put in our life so that there's not so much of that bombarding us every single day. God, we do not want to be desensitized to sin. We want to see sin for what it is, and we want to see right for what it is as well. I pray that you would give us clarity, God, and that you would help us, and that you would give each and every one of us the strength to make commitments to cut things out so that we can grow closer to you. And I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.